Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you all for joining us today. I'm sorry I didn't have the benefit of your earlier testimony. Some of what I may ask you may appear redundant, given what you talked about earlier in my cursory review of some of your written comments. But it seems to me that the outcome here is that this is a big mess. If I could summarize it succinctly, Dr. Wilder, I picked up on a statistic in your written testimony that basically 75% of the aid is going to 2% of the population. Is that a key finding? Is that correct?
No, I think that was the $750 million of U.S. assistance is going to the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, which make up 2% of the population. But there is a much larger USAID program as well, which is also going to other parts of the country.
Okay, but the total, it's my understanding, the total contribution is $1.5 billion.
With the new Kerry Lugar bill, that's the proposal is $1.5 billion per year over a 5-year period.
Yeah, so
that's not been appropriated.
Framing it simply, then half of the money is going to a very narrowly targeted area, and that's correct. And you've made the suggestion that the linkages between poverty mitigation and social services are not achieving the hearts and minds strategy there, is not achieving security outcomes that you would hope to be an intended consequence of capacity building. Look, I'm very much for cups of tea strategy where you relationship build and establish communications, establish trust, partnerships that can lead then to mutual understanding and long-term continuity in capacity building. But given some of the complexities as to how this is targeted, as to how it is institutionalized, it seems to me you're raising very critical points that we may have to rethink some of this with the intended outcome of strengthening the partnership and alliance for the long-term security situation of the region, not to mention the social justice outcomes we want to see for impoverished people around the world. Is that a pretty correct summary of what I've gleaned thus far?
Yeah, the point I was trying to make is that there is evidence that our development aid actually can have very positive development outcomes. I think where we don't have the evidence is the positive security outcomes. And that's where I'm arguing we probably need in some of these contexts to de-link those two and value development as a good in and of itself, even if it doesn't end up making people like us. Because FATA, the needs are tremendous. Although I would like to point out it's actually not the poorest region in Pakistan. There's things that can be done there. I personally, though, don't think that we can spend $750 million effectively in a 5-year time frame in a highly insecure environment like FATA. So I think then you can end up fueling corruption, and some of your aid can end up having perverse and negative consequences. But I think it's not to say we shouldn't be doing anything in FATA, and it's certainly not that we shouldn't be trying to do lots in Pakistan. But we should be very aware that where our aid development is good for promoting development objectives, there's not evidence that it's really good for promoting our security objectives in Pakistan.
Maybe I misstated that earlier. Maybe I said 75% of our aid is going to 2%. I meant $750 million of the aid is going to 2% of it. What is let's unpack this a little bit further, the other bilateral relationships that Pakistan enjoys, and then the collective or cumulative effect of the aid that is pouring in there to either further complicate your findings, assuming their objectives are the same in terms of long-term security, stabilization, as well as social justice outcomes. Can any of you give me any insight into the other donor countries and the approaches there? And I want to say this as well, and this dovetails with the question. It seems to me there's this raging dualism in Pakistan with regard to the United States. We want the money, we'd like your money, but we don't want to be your friend, maybe, except behind closed doors. And so is that a distinction in terms of other bilateral relationships that the country enjoys? Yes. Dr. Fair.
Well, there are a couple of programs I'm familiar with. DFID has an interesting approach. So DFID does the same kinds of programs that we do. I believe there is coordination with DFID, for example, taking the lead in Baluchistan. The British, thank you, the British aid organization, DFID. But they're also very interested in doing what I'd suggested in my written testimony, which is supporting their supply-driven efforts. So, for example, whatever intervention they're trying to do, they're trying to support it with a civil society outreach to create demand. So the example I gave was corruption. So it's one thing to try to clean up a particular bureaucracy or a particular service delivery, but unless you also engage in civil society to educate people that actually, while it might be efficient to pay a bribe to get a phone line, that in fact it makes everyone's lives more difficult. So they're really interested in trying to build this demand for change, even while they try to supply it. The Canadian agency, CETA, is much smaller in profile. They work primarily through NGOs, and they seem to have a very different aid delivery model. So one thing that USAID might want to do is look at these different organizations. The Japanese are also heavy investors. They've also heavily securitized their aid. And when I've seen analysis of the Japanese aid program, there are very similar critiques to those of USAID. Now, Pakistan has a lot of other partners, which they tend to use to bribe us. So if you don't do XYZ for us, we'll go to China. Of course, they have a very important relationship with Saudi Arabia. They also get, and it's pretty hard to discern, a lot of money through, we can't say they get money from Saudi Arabia per se. They get money from remittances. They get money from religious organizations. So there's actually quite a bit of money going in. You know, I've actually, one of the things that's so frustrating in dealing with the Pakistanis is that they tend to view our aid as an entitlement. So when we cut the aid back, it's viewed as a penalty. And because they view it as an entitlement, this issue of sovereignty, you know, how dare you say that we're your important ally, but now you want to actually subject the way we deal with your money with scrutiny. And this has been a very long-standing problem, and it's pervasive not only in USAID, it's pervasive. We saw this with the coalition support funds. Virtually any program that we have with the Pakistanis, it's subjected to these problems.
Mr. Chairman, if you could indulge me just one more moment. Is this a kind of a purposeful dualism in order to, again, because of the internal political dynamics, create a position of authority and power and legitimacy in the country versus, again, behind closed doors, actually needing the aid for long-term governmental stability objectives?
I actually do believe that to be the case. Yeah. So a really good example of that is the drones. The reality is the drones do not kill that many civilians. I have this from very well-placed Pakistani sources. Their administration knows this. The drones are run from Pakistani territory. It's done with their permission. We're not obviously running drone operations in a rogue way. And in fact, in Pakistan, the drone discourse has changed. During SWAT, when 4 million people were being displaced, if you read some of the op-eds, they were saying, why don't we have drones? Because drones don't displace millions of people. But the civilian government, rather than taking advantage of this, has continued to whip up anti-American sentiment over drones. Yet I assure you, if we stopped the drone attacks, their security would be worse, not better, in my opinion. So I think they do try to create this wedge because it then gives them an out to do less when we're asking them to do more. And I particularly see this on the security side of things. They're constantly asking for more. They're constantly talking about their sacrifices, which is reasonably fair. But I think that we have not struck a good bargain. You know, on the main, you know, they've been marginally satisfiers, and this is true across the board in many of our engagements with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.